have a question. Have I told you the story of the two young fish? Nod up or sideways? Oh, okay. Two young fish were swimming along in the current, and they happened to meet an older fish swimming the other way. The older fish nodded at them and said, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" The two young fish swam on for a bit. Eventually, one of them looked over at the other and said, "What the heck is water?" It can be hard to see something that's around you all the time. But noticing doesn't bring any guarantees either. You remember that 1990s pop star, Christina Aguilera? Yeah? She was once introduced to that famous golfer, Tiger Woods. And Woods declared, "Oh, Christina, I love your music. I have every song you've ever sung." And Aguilera smiled at him, and she said, "Sorry, I don't follow tennis, so I don't know much about you." She didn't know much about him, did she? And what she thought she knew was wrong. So this morning, the sermon is going to be about the water that we swim in, our church, and maybe even identifying parts of it as salt or fresh and trying to think about how that has changed over time. Because this church has grown in the last several years. And so this church has changed in some ways. I'm going to tell you one more story that relates to this. It's an old Taoist story about a wise man who lived on the northern frontier of China. One day, for no reason, his son's horse ran off and was captured by nomads who brought it across the border. Everyone in the village tried to console the son for his misfortune, but his father said, "What makes you all so sure that this isn't a blessing?" Months later, the son's horse returned, bringing with her a magnificent stallion. This time, everyone was full of congratulations for the son's good fortune. But now, his father said, "What makes you so sure this isn't a disaster?" Their household was certainly much richer by this new fine horse, which the son loved to ride. But one day, he fell off the horse. He broke his hip. Everyone in the village came to the house to offer their consolation for his bad luck. But his father said, "What makes you so sure this is not a blessing?" A year later, the nomads across the border to the north mounted an invasion, and every able-bodied man was required to take up his bow and go into battle. The Chinese frontiersmen lost 9 of every 10 people. Only because the son was lame did the father and the son survive to take care of each other. This folktale reminds us that understanding who we are, whether blessed or unlucky as in this story, or our other features, isn't a simple thing. So, who are we? Who are we anyway? Well, we're a church, obviously, which means you can look at who we are from the perspective of our formal and informal ways of arranging our affairs and governing ourselves and our relationships. You can think about our purposes and our principles, which you can find on the back of our order of service, and the fact that we share these with other churches in our denomination. We also have values that can be teased out by looking at how we behave as a group. Believe it or not, many of the ways of governing and manifesting our sense of purpose can actually be linked to our size as a church, which is why growth over time, change in size over time, can have a big impact on a community. In fact, there's a whole group of people whose work is to study churches and their size and what changes and why do some churches get bigger and smaller, and especially what affects that kind of thing. Now, when we look at our church using size as a lens, we really can learn a lot about who we are, who we've been, and what we're changing towards. Our lay leadership here at this church has actually spent a good deal of time over the last several years reading books that are related to this topic and trying to think about it and have discussions with Reverend Tim about some of these issues. So what I'm going to share this morning is really going to draw on some of that conversation and that learning. Who are we? In terms of raw numbers, we're 316 members and a number more friends. I think the number is 75 to 100. I'm not sure about that. And we have about 140 children and youth that are part of our church. So from a numbers perspective, that's who we are. This is bigger, significantly bigger than it was a few years ago. We've grown. And as we've grown, we've changed. And we are in the process of shifting from a church that has been pastor-centered to a church that is program-centered. And it relates to our size change. So what does this mean? Well, a pastor-centered church is one that's generally about 75 to 150, 175 people who attend church regularly. And what really characterizes this church is that the minister is sort of the center of the wheel. The minister engages everybody as friends, cares for their pastoral needs, provides their basic growth experiences through adult enrichment, and serves as their spiritual sage. He or she does a lot. Another characteristic of this smaller sized church is that almost everyone recognizes or knows everyone else who attends, and it feels like a large extended family. There's a UU church consultant named Robert Latham who characterizes churches of this size as tending to be mutually affirming and embracing communities. This strong feeling of community is crucial to the identity of the church. Finally, churches of this size and our tradition are governed in a consensus-oriented, democratic, with a small d way. There's an expectation that all important decisions will be made with nearly everyone's input. The larger churches, usually we're talking on the order of 175 people to 450 people, are quite different. In these churches, the minister can no longer provide direct pastoral care to each congregant, and indeed can't even know everybody well. There has to be a spirit of partnership between the lay leadership, the staff, and the minister, and they need to function as a team for the church to work. The sense of community is really different too. Rather than everybody knowing everybody else in a sort of single-celled unit like the smaller church, in the larger church, people will know a few other people well through some of their small groups, like chalice circles or participation in committees or teams. But they're connected with the people beyond that smaller circle through a shared sense of identity that's not based on being a mutually affirming community as much as a sense of a mission. People say that the mission is at the heart, at the center of a larger church, whereas the minister is at the center of a smaller church. Finally, power and authority in smaller churches and larger churches are handled very differently. In larger churches, power and authority are pushed out to the programs which embody the mission of the church. And governance becomes Republican with a small r, rather than democratic with a small d. As a result, trust, the feeling of trust, becomes a crucial lubricant in the life of the larger church. So where does our church land in this picture? Well, it's a mixture, because growing is a process. These things change over time, and it's not moving lockstep. But in some ways, we still look and act like the pastoral church that we were a few years ago. We still tend to focus on our community, our own community, more than on the world beyond our doors in terms of our energy and activities. And an important part of identity is still that we're a church that mutually affirms and celebrates our community. And it's not an either-or. We don't give up community in order to be bigger, but it's a different sense of community. And yet, in many ways, this church has changed in ways that correlate with this growth in membership. More and more, it seems we're emphasizing both sides of our historical Unitarian Universalist mission to nurture our spirits and to help heal the world. This sense of mission has always been there, but it's being reflected more and more in our programming and in our social justice efforts and in the new beginning that we've made at organizing a church-wide social justice initiative, the new Planting Seeds food-themed initiative that every segment of our church is invited to participate in. Is this kind of a church-wide effort, and it's really the first time we've done something on a church-wide basis in a sustained way. This is a 2-year project. You might be thinking, well, how does this reflect a larger church? What? I don't get it. The answer is that larger churches have to be held together by a commitment to a greater purpose than just attending to our own lives. We want to have an impact on the world that supports the mission. So if a larger church doesn't have this sort of thing, it will probably start slipping back to a smaller church at some point. Now, in terms of the authority and the role of the minister, our church has moved pretty far down the road to a structure that's sustainable as we continue to grow. The governing board makes policy decisions now, not day-to-day ones. Church programs have the actual responsibility of carrying out the mission, and the minister manages the staff and supports lay leadership, the lay leadership which is responsible for much of the programming. He doesn't and he can't do everything. He can't, for example, do all of the church adult enrichment that we want or desire or need, as once was the case. So, as you're in process, growing in our denomination, you can see there are a lot of changes that happen. Some of them are losses or can be felt as very deep losses. And I think the first one is that loss of the sense that we're one big family where everybody knows everybody else. If you're one of those people who remember when this church had just one Sunday morning service, you know that it feels different now. If you usually go to this service, if you walk into the coffee hour right after the first service, you may only know some of the folks. For those who remember those days, when everyone pretty much knew everyone else, that can feel like a big loss. Another change that can feel like a loss that church growth brings is the fact that the minister can't tend to every one of us personally. So members have to trust that the minister's pastoral care team will be well trained enough and motivated to do a lot more of the day-to-day pastoral care, while the minister guides and trains the pastoral care team and steps in the case of real emergencies. So that sense of everybody feeling personally connected to and known well by the minister gradually dissipates, and that can feel like a loss too. Another sense of loss, the final one I'm going to talk about, is one that can come from a change in the church decision-making processes. And none of this happens overnight or in step function. This transition can be messy and hard to put your fingers on. It happens gradually. When we were a smaller church, we had the capacity to make all of our major decisions in an inclusive way that prized consensus and the maintenance of community harmony above everything else. We're now too big to operate that way. If we did, our decision-making process would grind to a halt. For a faith tradition like Unitarian Universalism that prizes individuals and individual decision-making and the role of the individual, and that prizes the democratic process, this too feels very different and can feel like a loss. I'm bringing this up because it's good to name the kinds of changes that we've been going through and that we are part of so that we can see the water around us. And some of our pewmates may be having some of these feelings that I'm naming now. Let's also look on what we've gained. What have we gained by being open to growing and by welcoming growth? We've gained a lot. We've gained, for one thing, significant resources, which means we can sustain and produce a wide array of programs aimed at sparking our spiritual growth and igniting our children's faith, challenging us to be in community with each other in caring ways, and at giving us ways to tend our precious world that really make a difference. Our growth also gives us a chance to find greater clarity around our own mission, our own connection to values, to noble values, and to noble aims, and to the world beyond our own doors. For one thing, with so many new folks joining, you need to continue to reflect on what your mission is. You need to be clear about that. And for another thing, if you're not clear about your mission and you don't have a clear mission that looks outward, the churches will inevitably slip back to those smaller sized congregations that can be supported by personal direct connections between people, which is about 150 people. So being clear about our shared mission beyond our own well-being is absolutely crucial. And it's crucial to a sense of a life that's lived in alignment with our high values. So this is a gift. This is a gift. And another gift is this. Because we have more resources, we have the potential to have much greater impact in the world, close to us and further away. And if we work together as a church, we can have even more significant impact in the community beyond us. This is a gift. The last gain that comes to my mind when I think about the changes that happen as we go from a smaller church to a larger church relates to the potential for our own personal transformation. Spiritual transformation usually requires intimate connection between people, or between people and what's bigger than yourself. One's commitment to ideals can be strengthened, and hard truths can be understood when we intimately and authentically and trustingly relate to other people. So a smaller church certainly provides lots and lots of transformational opportunities. But I believe a larger, more outwardly focused church allows for even greater transformation, because such churches ensure that we have a sustained engagement with a community of folks beyond our doors. This means we have chances to engage in long-term, intimate relationships with people who are very different from the norm. It's these kind of relationships, these kinds of encounters with people who are different that will stretch us further and maybe even break us open in places so that we can listen for truths we wouldn't be able to hear just among ourselves. I have a lot of conviction about this, and I'm going to share a little story that will help you understand where my conviction about this comes from. 10 to 15 years ago, I was working in my town to try to educate people there about gay and lesbian people's lives and the impact of bias on our children. I've told you about this before. I organized, one of the first things I did was I organized a large 2-day conference in town that was going to have several panel discussions and movie showings, workshops, even Congressman Barney Frank coming to give us a pep talk. Now, the people I was working with in town were almost entirely white. But there was one woman who was an African American, and I met her because she led a parents group that was focused on supporting the schools, on helping the schools be supportive of minority kids. Somehow, she'd heard of what I was trying to do very early on, and she was the first person that actually publicly invited me to speak anywhere about what my kids faced as kids with gay parents in the schools and in the town. Her name was Sherry, and she worked to help me organize this weekend. She led a workshop on bias, too, during the weekend. And several times before the event, she suggested to me that I reach out and include more minority folks as part of my effort. We had several panels, we had workshops, and there was just one black face, one non-white face in 2 days of events. She suggested this to me several times, but I didn't do it. I justified it because I was thinking I only wanted Lexington residents involved, because the anti-gay folks were making lots of accusations that it was outsiders coming in and stirring up trouble. And I think I just stayed with the people that I knew already. Finally, after the weekend, we had a heart-to-heart. She was furious. She was so angry. And she was so disappointed in me that I had not been able to reach out beyond my little circle and bring in some people who would add a little more broadness to the spectrum of folks talking. And it was really hard to hear her anger and her disappointment. But she was right. I hadn't done the right thing, or I hadn't done as well as I could have. The only reason I could hear what she was saying was because I had a relationship with her. We'd worked together. I trusted her. She had done something for my community that was hard. So because of this experience I've had working with folks who are different from me, building relationships, building trust, I realized that this kind of relationship, this kind of engagement is a huge opportunity for personal growth and transformation. And that's what you can get when you have a bigger church that has programs that goes into other communities or the community around you on a sustained basis, and you get to be part of that. This church that we love, that we nourish, and that nourishes us is, I would estimate, about 2/3 of the way through this sort of morphing into a program church, the transition from a pastor-centered church to a program church. It's an exciting adventure, not without its losses, not without some muddling, but it's one that has gains, a lot of gains. And I pray that by our conversation and dialogue this morning, knowing a little bit more about the water and the different currents that we swim in, we will be buoyed in our growth and our transformation, and will be more enabled to be intentional and loving and thoughtful in our life together as a church. May it be so. Amen.